Hey everybody, welcome to Fishery. I'm Alexander Williamson, and as always, I hope you're doing well, and I hope you're excited to learn about cichlids today. So, cichlids have a fascinating history, and we're going to need to talk about a few things first before we talk about them traveling around the world. And we're not talking about them traveling on boats, planes, and trains for human amusement. We're talking about how they got to where they exist naturally. So if you look at a map, you can see that cichlids exist all the way over in eastern India. They exist in the Middle East, Central Asia, Israel, around the Strait of Hormuz in Iran. They exist in Central Africa, in Western Africa, kind of Northern Africa, and they have fossils that existed in the far north of Africa. Because the Sahara Desert used to actually be a giant inland sea and was salt water for a while, but it was also freshwater lakes at other times in history. And we're talking about an ancient fish here, you guys. Cichlids go back a long time. In fact, they go back into deep geological time, which is really amazing and really fascinating because if you've seen one of my other recent videos, we talked about the speciation of cichlids in Lake Victoria, which is not a rift lake, but it's in Africa, and it's near the rift lake species of cichlids. So you've got Lake Malawi and Lake Tanganyika that each have hundreds and hundreds of species. Malawi may even have up to near 1,000 species and variations of species of cichlids within that lake. And Lake Tanganyika has something like 400 to 600, depending on who you ask. Now, these are, at the oldest, something like 16 million years old. So that is a decent amount of time for something to evolve, considering modern humans are 200,000 to a million years old. And if you go back about 40 or 50 million years, we are crawling out of the water, just starting to become basic mammals. Right after the dinosaurs kind of kicked the bucket, we're starting to look like squirrely little things. Our common ancestors, that is. So, farther back than that, double back time-wise than that, into deep history, we have the first fossils of cichlids. And we find these first fossils in modern-day Tanzania. About 120 million years ago is the first fish that we see that has traits that are universal to cichlids. And one of those traits is the pharyngeal jaw. Now, this is basically a second set of jaws that's within the throat or mouth of a cichlid. And if you've ever seen like a bass pounce on prey, or a cichlid for that matter, an Oscar or something, eat, a lot of times you'll see their mouth zoom out, and if you've ever seen it in slow motion, you'll see that it jets out of their mouth, creates a vacuum, and sucks the food in. And then in the back of their throat, they have another valve or mouth that actually closes down and crunches down on the food. Sometimes that's in reverse, but this two-jaw system has allowed the cichlid family to evolve into some fascinating different forms. There's cichlids that can live in brackish water, and there's cichlids that venture into salt water every now and then. However, from that same common ancestor 120 million years ago, there is only one genus that exists of blennies, and they call them gobies, just common name-wise, but blennies or races that exist, and there are only two species in the genus that exist that are way past, have the same shared ancestry as cichlids. So we don't think they went into the saltwater and were very successful anyways. However, freshwater fish around the world, we see in India, we see in South America, like I said, we see in Iran, we see in Central Africa, Western Africa, Northern Africa, all over the place we see these things. We see them in the Bahamas, we see them all throughout the Caribbean and the south of the North American continent, from about Texas southward. So, how did they get there? 120 million years ago, they have a common ancestor. Well, there's a few schools of thought, And the schools of thought basically are based on fossil evidence and fossil evolution, and basically trying to group things by how they look and following the trail of fossils. However, what happens when you don't have a trail of fossils? When something catastrophic occurred, for instance, a dinosaur ending comet hits, right when fish are populating a region. So, for instance, our oldest fossils in Central America and the Caribbean for a cichlid, they're about 55 to 65 million years old, give or take, maybe 70 million years. So right in the middle of when they're populating that area, something catastrophic happens. So what do you do when the fossil record is broken, or you don't know what happened, or maybe the fossil record even below that in the ground, anything before that, was wrecked? So there's an argument there that people say, well, there's some issues in the places we're finding the fossils. So I don't have time to get into all of that, but I do want to tell you when the cichlids left, or basically when we know they continually inhabited certain places. So we know that in India, they continually, all the way up through today, inhabited that subcontinent since about 80 million years ago, give or take. Madagascar, about 75 million years ago, which is interesting to me that they made it all the way to India before they made it to Madagascar, which is just a little hop over the Tanzanian Strait. Now, also, the cichlids spread up and into northern Africa, into the modern day Sahara, as I said, which used to have freshwater lakes, also had saltwater seas, inland seas, and these came and went with time. Now it's filled up with a bunch of sand. But essentially, there were a bunch of lost species that existed in these lakes all through that region. And if you look at maps, there's still remnant populations in certain lakes up in northern Africa. Things even like up in Ethiopia and Kenya, where you get kind of pockets of these cichlids, and all through the Congo River and the Nile River. So we know that some cichlids can tolerate salt, but like I said, they're not going out into the oceans a whole lot. They're basically hanging out in rivers that happen to be brackish, maybe around the shores of those river deltas. Now, the cichlids that made it to the New World, I said that the first ones that made it all the way up into Central America and the Caribbean, they made it 55 to 70 million years ago. Probably more like 60 million years ago. And that is with keeping in mind that 5 million years before that, a giant meteor hit the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico and wiped out everything on Earth that looked like a dinosaur, essentially. Gave rise to new life. So then they made it to South America earlier than that. So they made it about probably 65 million years ago to something like 55 million years ago to South America. So we know that they were there by that point. Now, we need to talk about something, which is all of the continents were together at one point, and they formed a landmass that gets called Gondwana or Pangea, but we're going to call it Gondwana. And the Gondwana landmass had South America nestled in to the side of Africa. India was kind of scooted over there. Madagascar was too. And even North America was up and above. And Europe was kind of tucked in on top. So let's look at a video of how the last 150 million years have unfolded. This is keeping in mind that 120 million years ago is our first even pre-cichlid fossil. Before that, there's definitely nothing that looks like a cichlid that we know of. After this, we're seeing things in the lineage that seem to have a repeatable pattern. They seem to have the same body form. And just like most fish keepers that are passionate about fish keeping can probably tell you that's a cichlid. You know, maybe you couldn't say an angelfish or a pike cichlid or a discus is a cichlid, but most body forms they're pretty familiar, and even going back millions of years, they're pretty familiar. So as we see the world splitting up over time, over these millions of years, we see that the continents drift. And it was assumed for a very long time, until very recently, that the cichlids must have just drifted with the continents because they're freshwater fish, right? Some of them can withstand brackish water, but there's only two weird little wrasse blenny things that live out in the ocean that are even related to cichlids. So clearly everything failed if there were any ancestors out in the ocean. But nevertheless, one theory is that there was a universal oceanic relative that lived out in the oceans and then populated all of the land masses where we find cichlids today. However, that kind of leaves out, like, why didn't Southeast Asia get populated? You know, why didn't Australia, Indonesia get populated? And that's one of the weak points of that. Another thought was just that it split up during Pangea and they stayed relatively near where there were water bodies and things. And this was the popular hypothesis, and it was assumed that we would find more fossils soon that would fill in the blanks from 120 million years ago, from that African proto cichlid all the way up into something that would kind of be the missing link between that and, say, the 60 million year old South American cichlid fossils. And sorry to say that we just don't have anything like that. So recently a really interesting paper came out, and they did a study and they looked at the odds of cichlid fossils existing for 20, 30, 40, even 5 million years, and us not finding them yet. With the places that we've explored, where there's development in the world, where there's been a lot of excavating and digging, some of these places we find tons of fossils. And a lot of the fossils are really, really well preserved because fish die and they can fall to a deep lake bed. Oftentimes it can be, anoxic, or if they're brackish, it can be semi-salty. And if that has a low oxygen level and they're in the silt where there's no oxygen and the bacteria doesn't really live that decomposes things, it really preserves things for a long time and mineralizes and becomes a fossil. And so statistically, it's something like a 1 in a 700,000 chance that we haven't found the fossils, but they're out there. Now, how they did this, it's kind of interesting. I'm not going to get into it in this video, but looking at it, that was the analysis that, that is the chance that we're missing the fossils. And when you step back and think about that, it seems as though there must be another answer. Also seems unlikely that there was a saltwater fish, because we also don't have any fossils of those. We do have some fossils of the pre-blenny, the two species that are now in the saltwater, but we don't even have any failed Cichlidae relative species that are from saltwater environments that are now, for instance, at the top of a mountain or something, from 80 million years ago out in the sea, which is interesting. So how did this freshwater fish get around? Well, if you look at the way the continents were back then, it appears as though they left that Tanzania area, and throughout time, as the water levels rose and fell, cichlids would spread as the water would rise. Now, also the amount of water on Earth in general is going to change as ice caps are melting and as temperatures are rising or falling. And when the water was very low, that meant the ice caps or an ice age was going on. But it also meant that the distance between land masses could have been much smaller. So there's this, but there's also the flip side to think about, which is there's all this fresh water locked up in ice flows and in icebergs and ice sheets and glaciers. And when those melt, you have all this extra fresh water. So the salinity of the sea actually is reduced slightly. And not only that, but there actually were times in history when the Congo River and the Amazon River were kind of abutted against one another. And there was one point in time when they actually were the same river system called the Proto-Congo Amazon, or the Proto-Amazon Congo River. And it was by far the biggest river ever that we know of in the world. That is another interesting theory, that just like today in the modern Amazon River, the Amazon River has fresh water that you can drink 160 kilometers out to sea. So during the wet season, as all that water, 300,000 cubic liters of water a second are leaving the river. And the Congo can be between 50 and 80,000 cubic liters a second water leaving. And at a certain point, those two rivers flow out towards one another and could have actually caused, according to geological and meteorological forecasting, they could have caused a natural jet stream that kind of delivered the fish from east to west, but also delivered that fresh water into a stream that kind of flowed over the top. So if you had fish that could survive brackish water, there's no doubt that they could survive in the kind of water we're talking about here. That water, 160 kilometers out at sea in the Amazon today, is drinkable by humans. Now that is that's exponentially less brackish than what we would consider most brackish water environments that we look at for fish. Tilapia can be in, full salt water for short times and can come and go and deal with that. So it's thought that perhaps they speciated that way. And maybe there were different times when different rivers had lots of outflow and distances were shorter because the continents hadn't drifted so much. And perhaps that's how they populated. And so now what they're doing is they're looking at the genetics. So they've got all these pieces of the puzzle. And in 2020, a paper came out where they looked at the genetics, and they only had 14 species to compare. But they were looking at the genetics, and cichlids, and not just cichlids, but actually all of the rayfin fish, everything that's not a shark or a stingray or a weird coelacanth or lungfish or hagfish or lamprey, basically all the fish that you think of when you think of aquarium fish for the most part, they have double the DNA of even humans. And so that double amount of DNA allows them to modify very quickly. Just like in the case of Lake Victoria, where we get 350 species developing in a lake in 14,000 years, and we get the diversity you see today. Or even if you want to extend it to 16 million years and assume that the diversity in Lake Tanganyika or Lake Malawi took that long to develop, there's 1,000 species. Between the two, there's 1,500 species of different fish that evolved in that time period. So over 60 million or 40 million or, you name it, what could have evolved? And it seems very plausible when you think of it in those terms, that something, from discus to vieja to apistogrammas to angelfish to, I don't know, go wild, wolf cichlids, whatever you want to think of, those fish definitely evolved and changed and specialized. They fill up a niche really well, and they have that ability, especially with that jaw adaptation, that has served them oh so well. And if you watch that other video, we go into detail over why they're so successful over other fish groups and why they're survivors. But the DNA evidence that has come out seems to show as well that there are these branches or breaks that occur, and there are major chunks of DNA that are quote-unquote junk, or that double, that extra DNA that followed the fish to the New World, that followed the fish to India, to Madagascar, and those seem to be unique to those fish. Now they've done something like 127 cichlid species genomically looking at some of their DNA, not sequencing the entire fish necessarily, but looking at the things that make them uniquely cichlids. And they're seeing that the older ones have a bigger junk file on their computer, so to speak, in the DNA sense, than the ones in, for instance, the Americas that have 60 million years rather than 85 million years like the ones in India. But over time, they also lost a lot of the species, most likely, because other fish came in, the geology changed, and all sorts of other things. So it's an interesting thought. It's not 100% sure yet, but I wanted to tell you the story of what now they think happened, which is not a common sea ancestor populating, and not the continent splitting up, but rather flood events or water rising and rain and rivers going out to the ocean and massive amounts of fresh water floating up on top of the salt water because of the density change, and the fish riding that, the ones that can maybe withstand salt water, and it only taking one or two, pioneering ancestor groups of fish to make it a much shorter distance than it is today, say 60 million years ago when you look at the map, to make it to the New World or make it to India or Madagascar. So I hope you found this episode interesting. I think this topic's fascinating. The debate's still raging, but now it looks like we have more answers than questions finally. And I'd love to hear what you guys think, or if you have any other ideas about this topic. I can't do this channel without you guys. It means so much to me that you guys follow me, watch this stuff, and follow my crazy mind on these adventures. So if you like this stuff, hit that thumbs up, subscribe if you're new and stop by and not a member yet. You can also help produce and curate this channel for only $1.99. Plus you get access to 200 extra audio episodes of Fishery when you join, and it helps me make this a everyday love affair of doing big research for videos like this. Thank you so much, and if you want some of the reading materials from this video, just let me know. Take care, and I'll talk to you guys next time.